Good evening, everybody. This is Cinnamon Noir.
And this is the Ramen Shaman.
And contrary to what I was blithering about at the end of the last episode, today we're going to be doing the second optional dungeon and the third mandatory one.
Ooh, fun.
She felt cold.
So we'll start with the Ice Mausoleum. Pretty natural choice, given that we developed an ice power in the last episode.
Yep.
It was a water dungeon, but you got an ice power, which is kind of interesting. I'm trying to think of games that do that, because there are actually a lot of games with ice palaces, where you get an ice power. It is kind of hard to imagine a power that's based on water.
A bitter chill
They always go with
soaked her
ice.
to the bone.
Probably because,
The air felt heavy, as if laced with sadness.
I don't know, I guess freezing people has more obvious combat applications.
Right.
She set her jaw and moved through it.
Set her jaw. It's kind of an old-fashioned expression.
I guess. Not that old-fashioned, but...
Anyway, so this one... This, I would say, is the first dungeon where switching between powers for puzzle solving becomes a serious thing.
And her companion's warm
We saw it at the end of the last dungeon in terms of just fighting enemies. But here we're actually going to see a lot of braziers to set on fire and things to freeze at the same time.
Ooh, nice.
Which can be a little distracting, since you also have enemies at the same
Stones
time.
stood still and silent.
Of all the dungeons, this is probably, I'd say, the one with the least in it in terms of like exciting stuff happening. It's very quiet and contemplative, almost.
Mm-hmm. Do these things go out periodically?
Yes, they do. Finally, we're getting something akin to real puzzle solving in this game, something that's above the 6-year-old level. Each one of those torches has a separate timer, so they'll burn out at different rates, and you basically have to figure out which one you can afford to light first, and which you have to get to last.
Signs of death, places for lost memories.
It is fairly
together.
generous. I think the reason for that is that the game is balanced so that an ordinary typing speed person can get through it.
Mm-hmm.
So technically, if you type very fast, you can start with the one that burns out quickest and still get through it. But I've tried it, and it's actually harder than you might think. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to ask, does the adaptive difficulty come into play with the timers?
I have no idea. I cannot answer that question. My instinctual answer would be no, but at the same time, since this is literally all based on just number rolling, it could easily be that way. They could have made the game to do that. It didn't say anything, I believe, about how puzzle solving would get more or less difficult. And also, I honestly believe that at the level of typing we've gotten to, that if puzzle solving got harder, that it would literally be impossible at this point.
Music echoed down the corridors.
Since it's, I guess what I'm getting at is that the timers on those things, even at regular difficulty, are already fast enough that insane difficulty would probably be way too hard.
Its melody resonant with pain.
I mean, obviously, this game relies on something where there's a hard limit as to how fast a person could possibly type. There's mechanics involved. So, now that I think about it, a tool-assisted run of this game would be quite possible. A game where the computer typed for you. But that would be totally pointless. Then again, I've never really understood tool-assisted runs. I mean, surely the whole point of a speedrun is to demonstrate skill, right?
Yeah, I was going to say glitch-based speedruns in general are kind of stupid.
Well, it's a little bit different. I mean, technically, you know, a tool-assisted speedrun isn't that much different from, say, using a pen to rub the A button so it goes faster than it can when you tap it. I don't know if you ever played Banjo-Tooie, but there was one challenge in that game that almost seemed to demand that. And that's a primitive form of tool-assisted speedrun. I consider glitches to be a little different. I mean, glitches are literally exploiting something that the designers of the game didn't think of. I guess what I'm saying is, like, if you're in a maze, there's a difference between using a ladder and breaking through the wall. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Like, I'm thinking specifically of, there was someone who beat Fallout New Vegas in, like 20 minutes.
That seems a little ridiculous.
They used a cheat to like a saving glitch to essentially teleport.
Well, that's the funny thing about the Fallout games, is that since they're so based on scripted things that happen, if you could teleport yourself to the area where the end of the game takes place, the end of the game would just happen, right?
Kind of.
I mean, I'm not suggesting it's exactly that simple.
Corruption.
What I mean is, I think it'd be easier to cheese
Failure
Fallout if you could
every step.
hack into it than it would do that with other games.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, any game, if you're enough of a hacker or the game is susceptible to it enough, you can just, like, literally call up the end screen.
Mm-hmm.
Which is not exactly the same as winning. I don't know, I'm
Yet
torn
she
on
did not
glitches, because on the one hand I find them very interesting, and I like that people put runs in them, but I don't know that it makes much sense to look at the strict times and, like, rank
No.
when you see glitch runs. It's certainly not as impressive as when people get through it with raw skill.
Yeah.
And then, of course, some games, especially earlier ones, just tended to be made to enhance speedrunning. Like Super Mario Brothers, that game was built with warps for a reason, so that skilled players could go through really fast.
There was great beauty in the mausoleum. Dignity which flowed from
Metroid,
his
sort of more of a debatable point. Some people have speculated as to whether the speedrunning tricks and sequence breaks are actually intentional. And in some cases, Nintendo has actually patched them out of future games. So that seems to suggest unintentional.
I kind of agree with that, honestly.
Really? See, but there was one in Metroid Prime, I'm going to go on a tangent here, that I really liked, and I'm sad they removed it, where you could get the space jump boots early. I love double jumps. Anyway, I have been woefully neglecting my duty as a Let's Player and not explaining this puzzle, which we've run into a couple times now in this level. So, I guess technically a puzzle, not so much. This is more of a reflex challenge. You run across these little squares and they generate one next to them that you need to get to. It's not really platforming, but it does require you to get across the level pretty quickly. So these start here in the second optional level, but by the end of the game they will become mandatory. So if you're playing through this, you gotta learn how to do this pretty well. I quite like it. It certainly helps you learn to get around a lot better, and it teaches you to use the run button.
Is that wider expanse impassable?
There's rocks in the way. It's a little hard to see. I actually found it a little hard to see the first time I went through this myself, and bumped into them.
I guess.
Yeah, I didn't do too well at this, which is okay since this is a fairly generous puzzle here. This is an optional one, though. This one just gets you like a special treasure chest. The ones we saw earlier were mandatory, but they were a lot shorter.
Mm-hmm. Password.
Mm-hmm. It would be cool if it was swordfish at one point, but I don't think they would do that.
Password followed by swordfish would be
Yeah,
funny.
exactly. That's what I was getting at. Then, of course, talking about games where you can skip to the end intentionally, there's Chrono Trigger, or on a New Game Plus, I think you can literally beat the game in 6 minutes. Because you can go right to the end. As soon as time travel happens in the original game, in New Game Plus, you can go to fight Lavos. It's kind of crazy. Chrono Cross had a similar thing. What am I trying to say? Similar mechanic. Chrono Trigger is probably actually the first game that introduced a lot of players to the whole idea of New Game Plus. The idea that a second playthrough could be different from your first one. I mean, there's the second quest in Zelda and stuff like that, but I mean, there's no version of Zelda where you can, like, fight
Sometimes
Ganon in
droplets
5
slither
minutes
down
after you
the
start the
walls.
game.
Like tears.
And frankly, that's why I think they're not finished
today.
improving Zelda yet, because they need to do that. This is one of the first areas where you may start finding the problem where you run into enemies before you see them, because a lot of them show up just then. So here's another one of these dashing puzzles. This one's a little tighter, probably because it's a smaller area to run around, so they expect you to do pretty tight curves. I would say all things considered, these are fairly generous, these running things. In games with more traditional movement schemes, I've noticed much harder ones. But, you know, in this game, you're trying to get used to the mechanics, the unusual, like, EFIJ movement.
Yeah.
And so I think they take it a little easier on you.
I was gonna say, Because I'm guessing the movement is kind of clunky.
You get used to it eventually, but I think it's always a little bit of a handicap. And of course, this is the one game where you can't overcome that by plugging in a controller, because that wouldn't help at all.
Chitinous chittering's climax
Unless
to
you just want to spell
deafening hum.
ab.
This must be the heart of the song.
How about ABBA?
You could spell that. It's about the only band that you could spell, actually. Except for AC/DC.
She approached it, wreathed in icy armor.
I wonder if they've ever been on a double bill. It's quite unlikely, but you never know. It was the 70s. Anything could happen.
True.
Anyway, I'm going back here because I made a little mistake and skipped out on a secret. I thought that you got to it later on, but actually you have to go through a pretty hidden area. This is possibly the most hidden secret in the game, actually.
Oh, wow.
This chest right here. Yeah. I just did not notice it.
Yeah, that did not look like a doorway at all.
So now all the fragments are collected. I showed it just there. And from that you can probably tell why this is called the Ice Mausoleum.
Yeah.
So we're not keeping the subtext a secret here. This is about a girl. It's sort of her mental state. And I think there's a reason that this is the optional area for the college that Drowning Halls represented. It's because I think this girl's mother died while she was in college. That's the impression that's given. And that, of course, made a difficult situation even worse, because finding it hard to deal with her studies, she then had this to deal with as well.
Yeah.
And just the whole idea of it, sort of emotionally, there's a symbolism to it, because, these feelings, they sort of freeze you in place. You don't know what to do. So it's made out of ice. So here we have the final challenge.
Now I'm getting, thinking of Frozen.
Does someone die in that movie? Besides Olaf? And I'm not even sure if he really does. I just kind of...
Well, no, but
does.
the whole emotional repression thing.
That is true, yes. Anyway, in the end of the second mandatory dungeon, the Drowning Halls, we had to deal with fire and ice at the same time. But here, there are more of them and they come a bit faster. In keeping with the tradition of this, the fight here is very similar to the one in the mandatory dungeon, but it's a little harder.
Ice actually seems like a more useful power because it lets you temporarily hold enemies in place.
Ice gives you breathing room, which fire doesn't. Fire just makes the fight go a lot quicker. And it is true that ice definitely slows it down, because by freezing things in place, it encourages you to stall.
Yeah.
I would agree with you, generally, that ice is a better power. I would say that if you type faster, you'll probably want fire just because it'll speed things up.
True.
But ice decreases the difficulty of the encounter, I'd definitely say. For a lot of the hardest fights in this game, you pretty much need to use ice. Using fire will just lead to your getting swamped with enemies. Actually, I never thought of this before, but this will come into play later. The 4 powers that you have, the second 2 are kind of like enhancements of the first 2 in a way. Because the third one is a lot like fire, only maybe a little bit better.
An honest
And the
sadness.
fourth one
And
is
the
a little
mountain
bit like
thanked her for
ice.
relieving it.
And I'm not sure if it is actually better, it's just different.
So I guess it would be too much of a spoiler to tell me what they are.
I have no idea, but I'm not going to do it anyway.
Oh.
Just in case.
Oh, okay.
Let me put it this way, Greg. I trust you with it, but not the audience. No.
Fair enough.
Anyway, I don't know why I didn't get these ice things earlier, but I sort of did during this playthrough try to mix exploration with the dungeons. After each dungeon, do just a little bit of exploration to unwind. Not really necessary after the Ice Mausoleum, because it's very low-key, to begin with.
Yeah.
There's really no energy that I need to burn off, but I figured I'd just go ahead and do it anyway. Unfortunately, that didn't lead anywhere, so it was kind of a waste of time.
Did you have... Did I forget about you having the ability to fast travel?
You might have. I got teleport midway through the second episode, I believe. It's one of the upgrades that you can buy with the the score upgrades.
Well,
I didn't know how to refer to it. It's an upgrade system that's dependent
Idle
on the
winds
points that
played
you
in her hair. She smiled for a moment,
consummate professional I am.
delighting in its feather touch. Until the wind picked up.
Speaking of sequence breaking, this is the start of chapter
Tornadoes
4.
fury blotted out
So
the
I skipped a
sun.
whole chapter here. So if you're astute, despite my professed thing earlier, you will probably already know what the next power is. Sorry, not next, what the fourth power is. Anyway, this area is kind of interesting. It's sort of more of a beach-like area, and there's houses all over the place. Which actually, the next area, we're also going to see a few houses. In general, this seems to sort of go from more natural environments to more man-made environments, which may also have a symbolic significance that I'll get to in a bit.
Something about her post-college life?
Well, there's definitely a theme in this game of moving from childhood to adulthood. Oh, what the heck, I'll just spill it. I think there's also a theme in this game of slowly coming out of her fantasy, moving from the deeper parts of her mind more towards her actual life. More realistic, if you know what I'm talking about. This is all headcanon, but, it works for me. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate a game that can, lead me to think all these crazy things. One thing I think this game is very good at, that I've noticed recent games kind of struggle with, is being thought-provoking without necessarily having a lot of serious concepts overtly told. Mm-hmm. So there's very little overt storytelling in this game, but at the same time I find it very, not so much inspirational, but thought-provoking. I had that problem with Bastion, Bastion made a lot of things very overt, but I never really thought much about it beyond what I was being told. I didn't try to figure out what the history of this world was, or what things meant. I think partially just because Bastion's a little too arbitrary, if you know what I mean. Because the areas just pop up in front of you, and it seems often like it's just what the creators thought was cool at the time. There doesn't seem to be much coherency to the world, that's all I'm saying. I shouldn't bash Bastion. I mean, it wouldn't be fair. I haven't played much of it.
I guess there's some truth to that.
It's just an impression. It's
the world,
I wouldn't,
areas
I wouldn't bet my life on it.
Are very distinct from each other. I hadn't really thought of that as a flaw.
I don't know.
Personally.
There's no need to think about that right now.
I guess.
No one needs to take my opinions on game design too seriously, considering I'm playing a typing game.
Optimism.
Tangible. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I'm fooling around right now, but we are approaching the third area. We actually were right next to it for a moment, but we couldn't get in because we were blocked off by that little door that had the yellow orb next to it. This is a strange little area. There's nothing in here. The reason for that is that... Sorry, go ahead.
I was wondering if it was something about the shape, because the shape looked like some kind of symbol, but maybe I'm reading way too much into this.
Yeah, that's my fault. Me talking about how subtle this game is. No, the reason for that is just that we haven't fully unlocked the area yet.
The ruins stood empty.
This is one of the few places in the game that actually are like that, where you can sort of go to an area even though it's just bare.
Stories might be found amongst the crumbling stones.
So this is like a little town, but it's all torn to pieces. And you may also have noticed that the grassy areas are giving way to more like chalky and dusty environments.
She tasted a memory of copper on her tongue.
Ooh.
Clouds
Yeah, now
like
I'm
black
seeing
ink
that.
rolled across the
And
sky,
now we have finally the
and
third
lightning
chapter.
smote the bitter earth.
Steampunk. Static Shock.
I remember that. That was actually a really crappy TV show when I was a teenager.
She had never seen a
I
storm
remember
like
this
that before.
show. I didn't remember it being bad.
No, I didn't like it. I'm just being opinionated for the sake of it. I actually don't remember too much about that show. I remember the guy and how he would surf on, like, a trash can lid, basically, because he could magnetically charge it. And I remember his friend, who was annoying. I think he had blonde hair. That's about all I do remember, though. What we're seeing unfold here is actually the third optional dungeon, which we are not getting to in this video, unfortunately. But there's a little glimpse of it. If you try to head for it, before you get the power from the third level, you'll notice that your way is blocked off
and deserted
by that yellow thing, and more importantly by yellow enemies who you cannot defeat.
Ah, because they require electricity.
Yes. Yeah. That is in fact the third power.
I mean,
we'll get it pretty soon. Oh, I know it is.
Fearful thing. A force that must not be unleashed again.
This game's just determined to thwart me. I'm like, I'm not going to tell you the last two powers, and then in about 10 minutes, I accidentally reveal both of them. So it's interesting to me that all of the chapters in this game have names that aren't the same as the names of the levels.
Up ahead,
so the name of this level is Static Shock, but the name of the area is actually Creation City.
Something new.
Which is interesting. It's one of the few places in the game that's not named after either an element or what it is.
Does the word abscistic, is that related to an abscess?
I have no idea because I've actually never seen that word before.
Yeah, that's a number of these words.
I did have a vague feeling while I was playing this that some of these might have been made up.
Did she go to college for engineering by any chance?
Me?
No, she.
Now that is an interesting idea. I don't know.
I mean, that would be consistent with this.
And be very topical, women in STEM fields.
She stood below a skyborn city, amongst its roots of iron and steel.
But no, I don't believe that's what this is getting at necessarily. Creation City is based on her post-college life, and mostly I believe it's based on her trying to adjust to living on her own and being in a big city. Where you don't know anybody. It's hard to, figure out where to get stuff. I've never lived in a big city on my own, so I wouldn't
rust
know.
And ruin.
I'm trying to get to some conception of what it might be like, based on fiction that I've read.
Devastated by the wrath of the storm.
Greg, you actually have more experience with me than that. Since in college, you kind of lived by yourself in the middle of the city.
Yeah, well, I wasn't very good at it, so...
Well, you identify with this girl, then.
Yeah, no kidding. Actually, what I'm thinking of now, you've watched Ghostbusters, right?
The movie?
She recognized
the original movie. I've watched it.
You don't know what it's like out there.
And the fires of creation.
You've never been in the private sector.
The strange constructs.
No kidding.
I've worked in the private sector.
Hey, expect results. Oh boy. Yeah, that movie really is kind of a knee in the groin to academics, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'll take it.
I do really like Dan Aykroyd's character. I like Ray Stantz. Mostly because he's just so naive that he's likable. I love the scene where they end up putting out a second mortgage on his house.
Oh, yeah.
For your information, Ray, the payments for the first 6 months amount to $9,000.
Oh, God.
Anyway. No, for a minute I thought you were talking about the Ghostbusters TV show, which I've actually never seen in my life.
Neither have I.
I didn't like the idea of listening to people who weren't the guys from the movies voicing the characters. And also the fact that they looked totally different.
Hi, I'm lost.
Wait, what's this?
How could she survive a place like this? Then she saw the secret, the spark, lightning in a bottle, and her skin tingled with the static of
So this
creation.
is Spark. Spark does a few things. In one sense, it acts like a key. You can use it to manipulate these doors, and naturally, pretty soon we're going to run into some door mazes. Because really, what else do you do when you come up with a power like that? Another interesting thing are these bridges, which are basically folding bridges that you unfold, by typing in a series of letters over and over again. Usually letters, there'll be 2 for each hand, and you sort of roll over them, kind of like piano playing. Mm-hmm.
I was wondering.
If you've played piano, then these bridges are very easy to work with, because your fingers move in a rhythm. I'm not explaining it very well, but do you understand what I'm getting at?
No, I actually do. Now that I look down at my
city began to
keyboard,
awaken
I was
at her
wondering
touch.
if there was significance to the word I-U-R-E.
It's not a word.
No, the only thing I could think of was I think.
Eurus, like Latin.
Yeah, I think Latin sometimes used I instead of J.
That's right.
And
She could change it.
Jure,
She could heal it.
J-U-R-E was actually was a word.
To be pedantic, there really was no J back then. There was only I, and sometimes it was a Y sound, and sometimes it was an I sound.
But yeah, like Jure would be a I think it
Law.
means law.
That's just a coincidence.
De jure.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, so we're already running here into the first wrinkle in the doors, which is that what opens one door will close another one. And so we're going to see a few mazes like that.
Oh god.
This is the point in the game where maybe a 6-year-old couldn't get through it anymore, or would need some help from their parents. But their parents would probably be around anyway, I mean.
I had the weirdest thought when I saw a Tesla. I immediately thought this
Product placement?
No, well, product placement, and then I thought, is this girl Grimes?
What?
Elon Musk's girlfriend?
No, I do not know that.
Oh. You're probably better off not knowing it, but anyway.
That's true of a lot of things. Anyway, I was going to say, any 6-year-old playing this would probably have their parents nearby. I mean, who just puts their kid in front of a computer and lets them go to town? That would be like buying your 6-year-old their own smartphone, It's just something that no one would ever do.
Or letting your kid play GTA.
Do people do that? I'd be fine with any of them except GTA 5, where every character you play is just an unremitting asshole.
Yeah, especially Trevor, holy shit.
I mean, at least Nico, you can kind of see how he might be noble, in a weird way.
I mean, well, he had the sort of excuse of, horrifying trauma.
Right, exactly. When you come from, a former Soviet Balkan nation, it's okay for you to murder a few people. Because it's better than what you would have done if you'd stuck around. Maybe. Yes, yeah. Actually, it just occurred to me that my interpreting Balkan nations through the lens of GTA is actually kind of racist.
Possibly, yeah.
Or at least ethnicist.
She did not truly belong.
So there's a new interactable thing here that's kind of interesting. These sets of lanterns.
Oh, I-N-U-I-O-T-O.
Each of them are just 2 letters, so you can shoot them really quick. I kind of like to think of them as being bottles set up along a shelf for you to knock down.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of what they feel like when you're typing at them. Rupee, yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, those were all money themed, which actually makes sense for a treasure chest.
Yeah, interesting fact, actually, I just thought of. Rupees...
It made me think of Zelda.
She could make it her home.
Well, this game actually does take a lot of hints from Zelda.
But rupees are a real currency in some countries,
That indeed
right?
they are. They are Indian.
That's what I thought, yeah.
No, it's interesting. Rupee, actually, I believe, is both the name of a type of currency and a type of gem. I could be wrong. What I do know is that there are other things that are currencies and kind of gem-like. For instance, sequin was once a currency.
That actually makes sense if you imagine that I wouldn't be surprised if gemstones were once at least part of the basis of that currency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially in the Middle East, where they might be more common than metals.
Well, I mean, pounds were originally pounds sterling, right?
Pounds of silver, that's right.
Yeah, just like the price of a pound of silver.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, I don't know if you've ever read The 1001 Nights, but when Sinbad the Sailor gives Sinbad the Porter, which is just a hilarious part of that story, but that's for another day. When he gives him money for listening to his stories, it's a bag of sequins. Which sounds really weird to us today, because that makes it seem like he bought him off with some, dollar store junk.
Yeah.
But no, actually, it's a lot of money. It'd be like giving him $1,000 every night he listened to one of his stories. And since there were 7 stories, it's a lot of money. And all because he has the same name as the guy.
Well, it would beat the Arabian Nights, where the lady had to keep telling stories just to not die.
Yeah, the 1001 Nights is really weird. That's what I'm getting at, I think.
Probably.
Some people say that one of the stories from 1001 Nights is the first detective story ever. A Shah, I think, sends his vizier out to determine who committed a crime. Only in that story, he doesn't actually manage to solve it, and he ends up dying as a result. So, it's not a classic detective story.
Yeah, I can't exactly see Arthur Conan Doyle borrowing that particular plotline.
Why, Holmes, said Watson, as Holmes was preparing to go to the dock. I never expected to find you in this predicament.
To belong.
Shut up,
Among
Watson,
the
said
ironworks, the strange towers.
Wait, why are you going back?
I made a little mistake.
Oh.
No, but I get over it. It just occurred to me how stupid I was being, having a third-person thing for Sherlock Holmes stories. They're all first-person. Watson tells them.
Keep the machines on for me.
Yeah, that's actually a good point, and I should have caught that.
I know. I have to punish myself because you weren't there to do it.
But also, it also occurred to me, the thing with inexplicably backtracking. I have done that so many goddamn times.
Yeah. This is fresh enough in my mind for me to remember doing these things, so it's not like I'm completely confusing myself. For instance, later on, I'm going to have to explain my past self-behavior when I do something stupid.
Igneous.
Kind of odd. This isn't the fire area, but...
Well,
it did show up a lot in the fire area.
But it's related to rock, and it's more scientific, I think, than most of the terms we've seen for rocks so far.
That's an interesting point. You're saying maybe the words are getting a little more highfalutin and technical? A lot of the words in here are technical. You may have noticed on those little pillars that I have to light up to make the elevators work.
That's why
there's a lot of technical terms.
I'm starting to suspect that she was an engineering student.
Yeah, I'm not sure, because this is all about her life in the city on her own. I almost think she was supposed to be an artist or some kind of creative type. There's some indication of that with later stuff, but I'm anticipating.
She saw glimmers of light far above her, and dared to think that she herself could shine.
Of course you can shine. People shine, places shine. Just don't go to the Overlook Hotel.
Oh god, I was like... I got that reference about, 10 seconds after I should have. And just before you referenced the, Overlook Hotel.
I just love in that movie how Scatman Crothers like, there's nothing wrong with room 319, but don't go in there, ever. And it's like, I think you could have played that a little better, Scatman.
Ah, well.
Maybe just tell him, it's boring. You don't want to go in there because it doesn't mean anything. But no, he's just like, don't go in there. Also, there's nothing in it. Anywho, so this is actually the first dungeon, and possibly the only dungeon, to feature extensive warps back to the beginning.
Huh.
Maybe because it's one of the longer dungeons. I think it may actually be longer than the fourth dungeon.
She found the homes of those.
The fourth mandatory dungeon, I mean.
Well, now you know what game I'm getting flashbacks to.
No, I don't. Say it.
Dark Souls.
Dark Souls! Every game is Dark Souls.
Well, no, just backtracking in dungeons specifically.
Yeah, I know.
Which, sadly, later Dark Souls games didn't do as much.
Yeah, I've heard Joseph Anderson mention that. Why do you think that happened?
I think because the level designers for Dark Souls 2 just weren't as good at their jobs.
But then why did it stick into 3, is the question.
It came back more in 3.
But it still wasn't the same as 1.
I don't know.
I mean, in the original Dark Souls, it kind of felt like, at any point while you were bumbling around, you might stumble on a way back to the Firelink Shrine.
Ooh.
Speaking of bumbling, yeah, I ran into him. In my defense, this is a very busy level visually, and it was kind of hard for me to see that he was coming.
One thing I was going to say about DS3 is, for some reason, they they went back to Dark Souls 1 in many ways, but they also held on to a number of ideas from Dark Souls 2, and not always for the better.
So, speaking of Dark Souls, how long do you think they are going to be able to hold off before someone suggests making a Dark Souls 4?
Oh, I'm sure someone's already suggested.
Because Miyazaki said he didn't want to do it. But, why am I forgetting? Hideo Kojima said he didn't want to make any Metal Gear Solid games after, the first one. So, what does that mean?
They've made, a different game called Sekiro Shadows Die Twice.
Yeah, I heard about that during E3. What do you think of that?
It seems to be different. It seems to be more, almost more akin to Ninja Gaiden. Mm-hmm. In terms of the way the gameplay works. What's
interesting to me about that game is... Oh, by the way, I should mention. Here we're seeing the battle use of Spark, which is possibly the best in the game. When you use Spark on an enemy, a lightning bolt will shoot to another enemy and get rid of one of its words. Or destroy it.
So it's like fire, but it hits other enemies.
And it can hit more than one, so it can act like chain lightning.
Ooh.
It is incredibly potent and, dare I say, overpowered for this game. Given that I am on adaptive difficulty almost the entire time in this game, and yet Spark still cuts enemies to ribbons. This game literally cannot get hard enough to counter how broken Spark is.
Well, I think part of the reason is because it's extremely good against hordes.
That's right, which is the game's primary way of enhancing difficulty, is just throwing more at you.
Yeah.
Spark, of course, is mostly useless against enemies with really long words, so they do a little bit of that later on.
Yeah, I was going to say, if
Each doorway stood
if they
Even
compensated
the
in that
deserted.
way by throwing individual hard enemies with very, very long words, that would largely nullify the effectiveness of Spark.
One area where this game didn't go as far as I think it could have is in having enemies try to fake you out. In other words, having words change on you, having them do things that were unexpected. I don't think it's a flaw, because this is pretty much the only game of its kind, as things are. And, they could make another one, which changes things up a bit. Or, even if they don't, I think they've been surprisingly good, considering how much stuff they had to essentially invent for this game.
Yeah.
At the same time, I do think they could go further with it. I hope they do. This game was worth the asking price, and I think a sequel would also be worth it.
They could
Really? Go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, they could have a challenge mode that's just, they pull words out of, either compound words out of German, or, proper nouns out of, Welsh.
Okay, that would be horrible. No one could do that.
Like those
Even the Welsh can't type that.
Yeah. Or just take, how German does compound, or does words with multi-adjectives.
Yes, I know.
It likes to just stack them all up into one big-ass word.
This is horrible, but I'm starting to wonder if back when Welsh was, the only language Welsh people spoke, if they had much worse literacy rates than the rest of the country.
Ow.
I don't know. And we'll probably never know.
Like most of the problems in Great Britain, I suspect the English are somehow responsible.
Oh. You and your English guilt. Lime guilt. Anyway, I was going to ask about Dark Souls. It's kind of sorry, not ask. Pontificate. I was going to pontificate about Dark Souls. So, with Zelda...
Yeah?
The games were based on Western fantasy fiction, and there were sort of hints of Japanese-style stuff. Then, with Breath of the Wild, they just decided that it basically takes place in Japan. And they went whole hog for that. Do you feel like Dark Souls is kind of doing something similar? That the games were based on Western fantasy, but they had sort of vague Japanese undertones, and now they're making Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, which is just Japanese.
Well, I think... To my mind, Sekiro is more like an entirely different thing.
Is it that different?
I mean, it seems to be, yeah.
Okay.
Honestly, actually,
well,
going
Breath
back
of the Wild
to,
was different.
You were talking about possible Dark Souls 4. I
Yes.
hope what I would hope is if he gets pressured into making something like that, he goes the Bloodborne route again.
Well, but he did do Bloodborne, and they still wanted to make Dark Souls 3, which says to me they're also concerned about brand identity. So I think no matter what he makes that is not Dark Souls, Capcom will want another... Sorry, Namco... Why do I always screw this up? Namco will want another Dark Souls.
There's some truth to that. Oh, well.
There's some crossed wire in my brain where I can't tell Namco and Capcom apart. Actually, see, that was not even fair. That thing literally spawned a foot away from me.
Yeah.
But then again, I am the one just bumbling around this maze, not getting anywhere. I don't know how I got so stuck on this, but it really just somehow threw me for a loop. I could not figure out how to get this set up to get through it. Anywho. No, I think it's interesting. The reason I asked about Dark Souls with the Japanese influences is that Miyazaki, like Eiji Aonuma and people like that, clearly has a really strong interest in Western fantasy. The books, the movies, and that comes out in the games they make. But they're from Japan, so they know a lot about Japanese culture, mythology, folk tales, just from that. And it's kind of hard to completely avoid putting that stuff in your fiction. And I think that's what eventually pushed them into just doing at least one game which is just Japanese, very strongly, despite the fact that the whole identity of the series is different from that.
Yeah.
I guess really this is just a form of me whining. I didn't like that they went full Japanese with that, because I thought it was kind of dumb. Hyrule is not supposed to be really Japanesey. It doesn't really fit with the way the stories are told. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
At least that's how I feel about it.
I understand that.
Dark Souls I feel a little different about, since it has a hefty component of horror, and the Japanese are really good at that.
True.
And Japanese settings are actually very good for that. You watch old Japanese movies, you see lots of creepy swamps, and barren fields where people have sword fights.
I like that it just has a sort of Japanese edge to it.
Mm-hmm.
The Sekiro game. It's like Western fantasy with sort of it's just tinged with Japanese influence.
Yeah. Anyway, as long as I'm bumbling around and making a complete ass of myself, and we're talking about Dark Souls, what Dark Souls level or world is your favorite?
Thank you. God, that was close.
I swear, one of those things will get me someday.
I'm tempted to just flat out say Anno Londo, and I have trouble.
So here's the worst part. That was actually the way forward, and I didn't see the bridge that appears, and so I kept trying to make my way through that door on the right. I didn't realize that is not progress, that I was already there. And that's just, looking back on this. Sorry to anyone who's watching this Let's Play. There's really nothing to say.
Oh well.
Anywho. This is stupid, because I've never played any of the Dark Souls games, and yet I still have some favorite levels from seeing what they looked like. So I really like, for instance, the Tower of Latria from Demon's Souls.
I want to play Demon's Souls, and I've heard a lot about the Tower of Latria.
It's a very interesting concept.
I'm trying to think of which other Dark Souls levels I really like. I actually really like I actually kind of like the early levels.
In Dark Souls? Like the Undead Asylum?
Like Undead Burg, I think is a very good teaching tool in many ways.
I always found that name kind of odd, because Burg is something that I think you're supposed to attach to another word to make the name of a place. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's another...
Like something Burg.
It's one of those names that, there's a little tinge... It has a sort of tinge of mistranslation about it.
Actually, a lot of Dark Souls text is like that.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Grossly incandescent, for instance.
But it adds a sort of unique flavor to it because... I've actually seen that with a fair number of Japanese things where just by they sometimes unintentionally use really odd turns of phrase just because.
But it makes it unique.
Just because they don't speak English as a first language, but what you get is to native English speakers, these turns of phrase are really interesting because they're so unusual.
Right.
Like, grossly incandescent, and sometimes they're good for a cheap giggle, like ceaseless discharge.
That, oh my god. The worst thing about that is, I'm pretty sure that it was a native English speaker who decided on that name. Or at least someone who had some familiarity with English.
Well.
Anyway.
I'm just watching you.
Just watching me screw up, I know. I was trying to
That's
divert the
alright,
conversation
that's alright.
so there's something else to do.
It makes me feel less flustered about doing the exact same thing when I do these Let's Plays.
Yeah, no kidding. The next time you actually do one.
Nah.
Okay, I think I'm finally starting to figure it out. And I'm like, wait, wouldn't this be kind of weird if this area was just by itself? And this is where I slap myself in the face.
Oh.
This is where my forehead goes on the table and never comes back up. Because look, it was right there, the bridge. And I realize you're supposed to approach the maze from another direction, and then by entering it from the top, you can go out the right.
Oh.
So that's where I was messing up this whole time, was assuming... Basically, I'd forgotten this entire section existed. That only serves to route you around to the other side of the maze.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, kind of a neat little area, and it's... The setup of it is a lot more evocative than what it actually does.
Yeah.
Like this little ladder tower, for instance. It's interesting looking, but it only has one purpose, which is to get you up to a vantage point where you can see that little gear.
Metal Gear.
Metal Gear.
Nah.
Uh,
That was just the first thing I thought of. You
would like to play Castlevania, don't you?
It just occurred to me, Metal Gear is like one of the most redundant things you can say.
There are plastic gears.
Are there?
Yeah, there can be, like in toys. However, they're more recent than Metal Gears. Yeah, it's Metal Gear is definitely a weird name. It's one of those vaguely mistranslated names we were talking about earlier.
I guess, yeah.
I don't know what.
Solid.
What do you think the idea of calling it Metal Gear was supposed to be?
Because
the Metal Gear's a nuclear weapon. That's its point. It's a mobile battle station / mech. So,
I have no idea.
Maybe the idea is like it's the last gear that slots into place for your nuclear arsenal. Could that be the idea? Like it completes the network, and suddenly you're unstoppable?
After playing MGS5, I
Corrosion was
completely
killing the
gave
city.
up on getting into the mindset of
Its
Hideo
arteries
Kojima.
clogged.
Alright, ordinarily I
with
do this with your Let's Plays, but I think the time has come. Let's find out what Metal Gear actually means.
Its home standing empty.
How the Metal Gear name is explained in Japanese, from Legends of Localization, which is one of my favorite sites. Let's talk about it while I do this final area, because with Spark it's going to be so easy it's not going to even be worth it.
Oh god, yeah. These enemies are actually kind of slow, too.
So, you remember Metal Gear 3, where Granon's talking about the Metal Gear?
No?
Great, let's
But
keep
go
going.
on.
So in English he says, yes, a walking tank, a robot. Are you familiar with the theory of the missing link between apes and humans? Well, this technology will be the missing link between infantry and artillery. A kind of Metal Gear, if you will. And this magnificent Metal Gear will mark a revolutionary step forward in weapons development. Whereupon Snake says, Metal Gear. Which is out of character, because he should have said, weapons development? In Japanese, with a simple translation on the other hand, he says, a walking tank, a robot. Have you heard of the theory of an evolutionary missing link between apes and humans? Well, this technology will be a kind of gear that links foot soldiers and weaponry. A gear literally made of metal. A great gear of metal that will usher in an evolution in weaponry of revolutionary proportions.
I wonder
So clearly-
if it sounds better in Japanese.
Well, it almost certainly sounds better in Japanese. So clearly
But-
in Japan, the idea of a gear as a metaphorical thing is like well established. Like a gear is something that connects something to something else.
But a bridge between infantry and artillery.
Right.
I mean,
Well, what they're getting at is that it's like a cannon, but also one that can move on its own steam. And that makes it difficult because, ordinarily if you had launching capabilities, they would...
mean like a tank?
Yeah. I'm going to try to
Like
explain why this is cool.
Technology we've had since
So, here's a brief crash course in Cold War ideology.
the early 20th century.
So, how does the Cold War work, right? Both sides have nuclear weapons. They have to launch them from silos, right?
Oh, so it's like tactical.
By the way, I lose this. So that means if you know where the enemy's silos are, you can keep them under watch and you can threaten to bomb them, and that keeps the status quo going, right? Keeps the Cold War going. One of the things that Reagan did that really sort of disturbed the Russians during the Cold War is that he put nuclear missiles on trains that went all around Germany, just a few, maybe a couple dozen miles away from the Russian border. Since they were moving, they couldn't be destroyed. I mean, they couldn't easily be destroyed. And that was sort of a new wrinkle. Nuclear submarines, this is also the reason they were so important during the Cold War, is because you can never pin down where they are. That's why so many Cold War movies feature ways to track nuclear submarines as a MacGuffin, right? So I totally get what Hideo Kojima was talking about when he said that a link between artillery and infantry that can launch nukes would end the Cold War.
I guess, although I mean, they actually did try to make tactical nukes that could be loaded in conventional artillery, or even
right.
or even in something akin to an infantry mortar.
Well, that's an obvious thing for any rocket program to look at.
Part of the issue was in getting, especially for the smaller munitions, getting something with a blast radius smaller than the significantly smaller than the maximum range.
It occurs to me, if they wanted to make that connection clearer, then the right name they should have chosen would be Metal Link.
Yeah.
The only problem with that is that then it sounds like Smash Brothers.
It sounds
Metal Link!
Yeah. It sounds like some kind of like Metal Sonic, but with Link.
Well, there is a Metal Link. I mean, you can fight against Metal Link in Smash Brothers.
True. Oh god.
I'm trying to think of a better name and I can't. Maybe that's the reason why they had such trouble.
It just occurred to me.
What?
Has Zelda never made a missing Link pun? Because they
not
should
the
have.
title.
If they had.
I don't think they should.
I mean, I realize it probably wouldn't work in Japanese, which
Right.
kind of screws the whole concept, but still.
Right, in Japanese, he's just called Rinku, which really makes him sound kind of like a girl.
Yeah, like Riku.
Right, or Rinko, I think is actually a girl's name in Japan. Not to be confused with, what's her name, Linka? Who is the female version of Link that appears in Hyrule Warriors?
Wasn't it Linkle?
Linkle, that's her name.
Honestly,
Linkle is a really awful name to me.
Yeah,
Sorry,
it's a
boys, gotta take a Linkle.
It's a terrible name. I don't know. I'm not that surprised by a female equivalent to Link, if only because Link's kind of always been kind of androgynous.
That is true. Except for his voice, which is always very manly.
I guess.
God!
Yeah.
Anyway. So, with that very relevant and important discussion out of the way, that's all for today, everybody. Next time we will be...
come away stronger.
Completely ignored this game.
Which is great. Next time we'll be tackling the third optional dungeon and the fourth mandatory dungeon. We hope to see you then. Bye for now.
Bye, everybody.